Good morning. And first thing I'd like to say is it's really nice to be in such a wonderful building. And I don't think we've recognised that today so far. It's a real inspiration to hear about a global award-winning building and then to be in it, isn't it? So I think we should all celebrate that. But I noticed that even though we've got an award-winning building, that they still have pies in the cafe here. And my talk is under the heading of the transition to the sustainable enterprise economy, because some of you may not believe that we're at the point of transition. We're in the middle of a movement. Whether you want to call it revolution or evolution, I don't know. But there's absolutely no doubt that everything that we know and everything that we do and all economic systems is changing at the moment, as we've heard from both the keynote speakers this morning and the breakout sessions you've just been in. I'm going to move from the global to the local and back to the global again, but I know that many of your breakout sessions have probably been dealing with local issues. So let's start with some big ideas. About 20 years ago, the Centre for Policy Studies came out with a bit of analysis which showed that of the top 100 economies, half of them were companies. And it was one of those pieces of research which got us to think about the size and scope of companies on a global basis. It was slightly erroneous in that it mixed apples and pears, but what it did was to focus us on the idea that actually a company economy could be bigger than a country economy. And this is particularly appropriate speaking in Australia, where really the economy is dominated by a few global giants. And I'm not just referring to Rupert Murdoch, of course, with his dominance of the news media here, but I'm referring to the extractive industry sector as well. But also Australian companies are innovative in that they are award winners at a global level, aren't they? And I know that NAB wants to beat ANZ and Westpac and get to the top of that Dow Jones Sustainability Index next year, perhaps. So Australian companies are out there, but this economy is very much dominated by global companies. One of the most interesting pieces of research in this space recently has shown, though, that of the top 100 companies, at the moment 19 of them are state-owned enterprises. 19 of the top 100 companies are state-owned enterprises now, principally from Brazil, Russia and China. But also one that Dirk didn't mention this morning. Well, he mentioned them, but he didn't mention that they're a state-owned enterprise, and that's the world's largest bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, which was, of course, semi-nationalised last year, or 2 years ago, when it nearly went bust. Which is an interesting thing, isn't it? The distance between government and business has shrunk considerably. And I ran a round table in Beijing 2 years ago of companies that wanted to talk about the sustainable enterprise economy. And round the table I had the largest Chinese companies in the world, and therefore I had many of the world's largest companies. So there were Sinopec, Sinosteel, Canuck, companies like that. And I have to say, of course, that they were extremely conversant with climate change science. There was no deficiency there whatsoever, and also there was no denial of it at all. And they were extremely conversant with the corporate responsibility agenda. But I was talking to state-owned enterprises. I was talking to enterprises for whom their largest and only stakeholder in most cases was the government. So doesn't that change a lot of the modelling that we've been talking about this morning, but also that the literature on corporate responsibility over the last 20 or 30 years has been involved in, where it said government, business and civil society, a sort of tripartite space where you talk about multi-stakeholder partnerships. If in fact 19 of the top 100 companies are state-owned enterprises, what does that do to that modelling? What does it do to multi-stakeholder engagement? How should we think about these companies? How should we think about them being innovative as well? Does their direction come from the market, or does their direction come from governments? Let's just drop into that the fact that some of the targets of NGO and media scrutiny over the last few years have been apparently extractive industries, particularly oil companies, but let's just remind ourselves that most of those extractive industry companies are actually knowledge organizations. They're brilliant at geology, etc. They don't actually own the assets. Most of the world's oil, other minerals, etc., is owned by governments. So perhaps that ire should have been directed at governments rather than companies. The companies were just operating under license from governments. So perhaps that changes a lot of our thinking as well. And this points to another problem that I have, particularly working in a university. Perhaps universities actually are museums of learning rather than cutting edge, but I continually come across colleagues in other disciplines who think that because I work with lots of companies, that therefore I must be dealing with the devil. The gap, the lacuna that exists between business and non-business thinking is still absolutely enormous. And working in that partnership space where you try to get people to understand that perhaps private and public policy are not that different, perhaps they're the same thing, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of the way we construct knowledge and the way in which people see this political debate. So where is the meeting point? Is it around partnerships, as we've heard a little bit this morning? Is it around multi-stakeholder engagement? And many of you, because you probably come from this industrial sector, by which I mean the CSR industry, are probably involved in multi-stakeholder engagement, aren't you? Is this the space for the future, or should we be really rethinking what we mean by political economy? I spent quite a lot of time over the last couple of months with the Occupy movement. Not because I wanted to sleep in a tent in a very cold place or a very hot place, not because I wanted to be beaten up by the police, but because I wanted to understand what was going on. It was being reported, the Occupy movement, remember, has about 3,000 sites around the world, has involved 100,000, 200,000 people so far. It is a global mass social movement. And I wanted to understand what it is that was going on because I wasn't convinced that the way it was being reported as, quote, young anti-capitalists, which is the way that lots of people had reported it, I wanted to see if this was true. Well, it profoundly wasn't true at all. Spending particularly a lot of time at the New York Occupy site and the London Stock Exchange Occupy site, I spent a couple of days interviewing people. And there were all ages, there were both genders, there were people who were employed, there were people who were unemployed, there were people who were libertarians, there were people who were pro-capitalist, there were people who were anti-capitalist, there were environmentalists. It was everybody. It was actually a very intelligent group of people in all places. At all of the places, they'd set up lecture theatres, they'd set up libraries, there were intelligent conversations going on. Of course, there were also other people there who were perhaps homeless who joined in as well. But generally, the debate was very informed. And there were four things that have occurred to me talking to those people that come out of my conversations. They also talked to people in Paris, by the way, and in Boston and various other places. And there are four issues that arose, which I think are very linked to what the corporate responsibility movement has been trying to do for the last couple of decades. The first issue that arose with everybody, didn't matter what their political spectrum was the issue of fairness. It's not fair that somebody's losing their job, that bankers are being paid X, Y, Z. It's not fair that the public sector is being diminished when actually private sector profits are going up, etc. This issue of fairness, which I think is actually at the heart of what it means to be human, was the first point. The second point that everybody brought up was the issue of accountability. How was this decision made? How do I find out how that bank was bailed out, or why that person's getting that, or why a road is being closed, or why a mine is opening in XYZ place? This issue of transparency and accountability was the second point. The third issue is similar to that, is about governance as well. That actually most of the people, even though they were very well informed, didn't know how the world works. How do we make global social governance work? Who makes decisions? How are decisions made? Are they made in secret? Extraordinary ignorance, not because of a lack of desire, but just actually people not understanding how global social governance works at the moment. And I'm sure that would apply to many of you. You're kind of bemused how interest rates go up and down, or how somebody makes $1 billion out of trading on Australia's currency at the moment, etc. Things like that. The sort of things that affect you on a daily basis. And then the fourth thing that came out of my research, which other people have commented on as well, is the problem that the media has had. The media has said, we don't actually know what these Occupy people are talking about. What do they want? What is it they want? Because what we want as the media is one line, you know. And this is different from the 1930s or 1940s, and it's different from some other revolutions around the world where people were able to say, we want to vote, or we want communism, or we want this. We've got a kind of a package. Most of the people that are occupied in the that I talked to in the Occupy movement talked about fairness, accountability, and governance, and not knowing, but they didn't have a grand vision of what society would look like in the future. I think that's really interesting. But actually, if you drill down to that, what they want is fairness and accountability, which actually is a very large political idea if you think about it. Just making a fairer, more accountable world and raising levels of education so that people not only understand Earth systems science, which is another vast lacuna for most people all over the world, but also global governance. How does it work? So I suggest a new political party based on fairness. Will it work? I'm not sure, because the press isn't very good at actually talking about large philosophical or political ideas. And this leads to the Rio +20 conference. I don't know how many of you are going to be there. And the report that Paul referred to earlier, the high-level group to the UN Secretary General, which has just come out about a week or 2 weeks ago. I don't know whether any of you have seen it. But actually, it's both an enormously depressing report and an enormously useful report. It's depressing because some of the people on it, well, it includes Gro Harlem Brundtland, for instance. Many of you will know her, Our Common Future. It also included Kevin Rudd, but also Susan Rice, the US ambassador to the UN, and many other people who are very conversant with the debate over the last 20 or 30 years. Remember, it's Rio +20. It's depressing in that it stresses that really in the last 20 years we haven't gone very far. We haven't actually made much progress. It's useful in that it talks about looking at the whole political economy rather than looking at individual silos. So it basically advocates a systems approach. It advocates looking at climate change alongside global governance. It advocates looking at water alongside strategic governance, etc. And actually we know from all the research coming out of management and business at the moment is that most boards find climate change particularly a complex issue and therefore difficult. How many of us are able to think in terms of systems? How many of us are able to make those links? So we've got a second problem there. We need to be teaching systems and complexity at all levels, to school children right the way up to the sort of courses that I teach on MBAs and things like that. So that report, high-level group, I suggest you go and have a look at it. Resilient Planet, Resilient People. Paul's got a copy there. It's quite short, but actually it's very useful in terms of pulling together lots of issues and saying we mustn't silo intellectual debates. The Occupy movement, I think, also mirrors what we've been trying to do in the CSR movement for the last 20, 30 years. And Dirk wouldn't agree with me on this, but I think just by virtue of working in this space and talking about it, I'm being activist. Dirk would probably see himself as a scholar, as somebody who stands back, is disinterested and just looks at it. I see myself, by virtue of working in this space, as being an activist and therefore promoting discussion about accountability and fairness. So what's happening with the high-level group, what's happening in the Occupy movement, and what we've been trying to do on CSR mirror themselves, because isn't what we've been trying to do in CSR about increasing transparency, about reporting, about accountability, and isn't so much of the work that people like Paul have been engaged in for a couple of decades now about reporting mechanisms, GRI, etc. How do we come up with those matrices? How do we report this? How do we communicate, etc. So there seems to me that there's a coming together of a whole range of different things. And Dirk, in his speech this morning, ran through some of the typologies for corporate social responsibility, corporate citizenship, etc., etc. So we've moved from know what you do, which was essentially the original CSR. Do you know what you do? Can you communicate what you do? Do you know what your social and environmental footprint is? Can you describe the size and scope of your company? By the way, that's still an enormous challenge for most companies around the world. They still don't know what they do, and they still don't know what their social and environmental footprint is. The second one, which was to do no harm. Now we know what we're doing. Are we doing harm by what we do? And what are we going to do about it now that we know, that somebody else said, now that we've found love, what should we do? To what people are now talking about, which is at the heart of the Rio+20 debate, and that Paul again mentioned there, where everybody expects the governmental piece, the